War has a way of revealing the worst in humanity, but sometimes, in the darkest moments, it shows us something unexpectedly beautiful. Picture this. It's 1941, and a group of Italian women prisoners of war are being marched through the Libyan desert. They've heard the stories, the propaganda, the warnings about what awaits them in Africa. They expect brutality, starvation, perhaps even death. Their hearts pound with every step into the unknown. But what happened next would shatter every assumption they held about their captors, about Africa, and about humanity itself. Instead of cruelty, they found compassion. Instead of hatred, they discovered kindness from the most unexpected source, the very people they'd been taught to fear. African villagers, who had every reason to turn away these representatives of their colonial oppressors, did something remarkable. They shared their bread. They offered water. They extended humanity to those who expected none. This is not a story you'll find in most history books. It's been buried beneath decades of propaganda, colonial narratives, and convenient forgetfulness. But it's a story that needs to be told, a story that challenges everything we think we know about war, about Africa during World War II, and about the resilience of human compassion in the face of systematic dehumanization. If you want to discover more untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring these forgotten narratives to light. What you're about to read will take you on a journey through one of World War II's most overlooked chapters, a story of suffering, survival, and the surprising bonds that formed in the most unlikely circumstances. The year 1941 marked a turning point in World War II's North African campaign. While most historical accounts focus on the military movements of Rommel's Afrika Korps and the British Eighth Army, another drama was unfolding in the shadows, one involving civilians caught in the crossfire of imperial ambitions. Among these forgotten victims were Italian women who found themselves transformed from colonizers' wives and daughters into prisoners of war. Italy's aggressive expansion into Libya had begun decades earlier under Mussolini's fascist regime, which promised to rebuild the Roman Empire. Thousands of Italian families had been encouraged to settle in Libya, promised land and prosperity in Africa. But when Allied forces gained ground, everything changed overnight. These women, nurses, teachers, farmers' wives, and merchants, suddenly became enemy nationals in a land they'd called home. British and Allied forces rounded them up, and their journey into captivity began. They'd been raised on fascist propaganda that painted Africans as primitive and dangerous. The colonial narrative had dehumanized the very people whose land they occupied. As they were marched through the desert toward internment camps, fear consumed them. What would become of them? Would they face revenge for their country's colonial brutality? Would they survive? The Libyan desert stretched endlessly before them, unforgiving, scorching, and alien. Their Italian shoes weren't made for sand. Their bodies weren't prepared for the relentless sun. Exhaustion set in quickly, followed by dehydration and desperation. Then came the villages. Small settlements where African families lived lives barely touched by the war machines grinding across their continent. And in these villages, something unexpected happened, something that would challenge every prejudice these women carried, every fear they harbored, and every assumption about who deserved compassion in wartime. This is their story. The Italian colonial project in Libya had always been built on illusions. When Maria Rossetti stepped off the ship in Tripoli in 1938, she believed she was part of something grand, the revival of Rome's ancient glory. Her husband, a low-level bureaucrat in the fascist administration, had been promised land, opportunity, and a future for their 3 children. The propaganda posters showed happy Italian families harvesting abundant crops under sunny skies, welcomed by grateful locals. The reality was starkly different. Libya had been under Italian control since 1911, when Italy invaded the Ottoman territories. But control was a generous term. Outside the coastal cities, Italian authority barely existed. The indigenous population, Berbers, Arabs, and various tribal groups, had never accepted foreign rule. Resistance movements simmered constantly. Mussolini's answer was brutal: concentration camps, mass executions, and the confiscation of lands that had belonged to Libyan families for generations. By the time Maria arrived, roughly 110,000 Italians lived in Libya, most clustered in coastal settlements. They existed in a bubble, insulated from the resentment that surrounded them. Italian children attended Italian schools. Italian shops sold Italian goods. They spoke Italian, ate Italian food, and pretended they were still in Sicily or Calabria, just with better weather. But the bubble was always fragile. When World War II erupted, Libya became a crucial strategic territory. The North African campaign wasn't about ideology or freedom, it was about oil, supply routes, and control of the Mediterranean. Mussolini aligned with Hitler, and suddenly Libya became a battlefield. German and Italian forces used it as a base to threaten Egypt and the Suez Canal. The women like Maria were told not to worry. Italy was strong. The Axis would prevail. Victory was certain. Then came 1941. British Commonwealth forces, including troops from Britain, Australia, India, and various African colonies, launched Operation Compass. The offensive shattered Italian defensive lines. Towns fell rapidly. The Italian military, poorly equipped and demoralized, collapsed faster than anyone anticipated. Within weeks, the strategic situation had completely reversed. For Italian civilians, the implications were terrifying. They were no longer protected colonizers, they were enemy nationals in hostile territory. British forces began rounding up Italian civilians for internment. The policy was practical from a military standpoint. They couldn't leave potential saboteurs and intelligence sources behind enemy lines. But for families like Maria's, it meant losing everything overnight. The roundups were chaotic and frightening. Soldiers arrived at homes with little warning, giving families minutes to pack essentials. Maria grabbed photographs, her children's birth certificates, some clothes, and, naively, her good shoes. She had no idea where they were going or for how long. Her husband had already been taken weeks earlier. She hadn't heard from him since. Women and children were loaded onto trucks. The men had been separated immediately, sent to different camps. The policy was deliberately disorienting: keep families apart, prevent organization, minimize resistance. The trucks headed inland, away from the coastal areas where most Italians had lived. As they drove into the interior, the landscape transformed. The Mediterranean greenery gave way to rock and sand. The temperature soared. The women huddled together, trying to shield their children from the sun. Some prayed. Others wept silently. Many simply stared ahead in shock, unable to process how quickly their world had collapsed. Among them was Giulia Ferretti, a nurse who'd worked at the Italian hospital in Benghazi. She was 32, unmarried, and had volunteered for colonial service, believing she could make a difference. She'd treated both Italian colonists and local Libyans, though the facilities were starkly segregated. Now, as a prisoner, she watched her former patients, the Libyan orderlies and staff, watching her convoy pass. Some faces showed satisfaction. Others showed nothing at all. Teresa Marchetti, a teacher, clutched her 7-year-old daughter close. She'd taught Italian language and culture to colonists' children, filling their heads with stories of Roman greatness and Italian superiority. Now those lessons felt hollow and absurd. What would happen to her daughter? Would they survive this? The trucks traveled for hours before breaking down. Mechanical failures were common in the desert. Sand destroyed engines, heat warped metal. The British soldiers accompanying them radioed for replacement vehicles, but the response was delayed. They would have to walk the remaining distance to a temporary holding area. This is when the real suffering began. Walking in the Libyan desert isn't like walking anywhere else. The heat doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it actively attacks. The sun reflects off sand and rock, creating temperatures that can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Dehydration happens rapidly. Without proper clothing, skin burns within minutes. The Italian women, dressed in the modest but impractical clothing of 1940s European standards, were utterly unprepared. Children started crying within the first mile. Their mothers, already exhausted and frightened, struggled to keep them moving. The British guards had limited water themselves. Supply lines in the desert were precarious. They offered what they could, but it wasn't enough. After several miles, an older woman collapsed. Signora Benedetti, 68 years old, simply couldn't continue. Her heart gave out under the strain. The guards called a halt, but there was nothing to be done. They buried her in a shallow grave marked with stones. It was the first death, but the women knew it wouldn't be the last. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the sand, the column of prisoners spotted something ahead, a small settlement. Mud brick buildings clustered around a well. Smoke rose from cooking fires. An African village, one of thousands scattered across Libya's interior. The women's fear intensified. This was the moment they'd been dreading. They were about to be delivered to the people they'd been taught to fear and despise, the people their country had brutalized for 3 decades. What revenge would be taken now? The village had no official name on Italian maps. Colonial cartographers had labeled it simply as Settlement 47. But to its approximately 200 inhabitants, it was home, as it had been for their ancestors for centuries. The village survived through careful water management, small-scale agriculture, and trade networks that stretched across the desert. When word arrived that a column of Italian prisoners was approaching, the village elders gathered. This was no simple matter. Everyone in the village knew what Italian colonization had meant. The older generation remembered when Italian forces had first arrived, seizing wells, appropriating grazing lands, and imposing arbitrary taxes. Some families had been forcibly relocated. Others had seen sons and fathers disappear into Italian concentration camps during the brutal pacification campaigns of the 1920s and 1930s. The estimates are horrifying. Between 1927 and 1934, the Italian military interned roughly 100,000 Libyans in concentration camps. At least 40,000 died from disease, starvation, and execution. The Italians had used poison gas against civilian populations. They had hanged resistance leaders in public squares. They had taken lands that had sustained Libyan families for generations and given them to Italian settlers. These villagers had every moral justification to turn away, or worse, when Italian prisoners arrived. Revenge would have been understandable. Indifference would have been expected. But something else happened instead. Elder Mahmoud, the village's most respected voice, spoke to the gathered community. His words would later be recounted by several survivors, though accounts vary slightly in detail. The essence, however, remained consistent. They are not soldiers, he said. They are mothers and children. They are hungry and frightened. Whatever their country did to us, these women did not give those orders. We will not become what we have suffered. We will show them what humanity looks like. Not everyone agreed immediately. Younger men argued passionately that the Italians deserved to experience suffering, to understand what colonization had cost Libyan families. Some women pointed out that their own resources were limited. Why share precious food and water with colonizers when their own children had so little? The debate continued as the sun set. But gradually, a consensus emerged, not from agreement necessarily, but from a deeper cultural principle. In many North African societies, hospitality is not merely a custom, it's a sacred obligation. The stranger, even the enemy, has rights when they enter your space. To deny food and water to those in need would be to violate fundamental principles that defined who they were as a people. When the column of Italian prisoners arrived at the village outskirts, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Villagers had prepared food, simple flatbread baked in stone ovens, dates, and cups of water drawn fresh from the well. It wasn't a feast, but given the villagers' own limited resources, it was generous beyond measure. Maria Rossetti, exhausted and terrified, couldn't process what she was seeing. Were these the same people Italian propaganda had called uncivilized? The same people she'd been taught to fear? A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, approached with a cup of water. She wore traditional Libyan dress, her face partially covered, her eyes showing neither hostility nor warmth, just a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. Maria drank. The water was warm, slightly metallic tasting from the minerals in the desert well, but it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. She tried to say, "Thank you," in Italian, then stopped, realizing how absurd it sounded. She had no words in Arabic. She could only nod, tears streaming down her dusty face. Giulia Ferretti, the nurse, watched the scene with professional interest and personal confusion. She'd treated infections and injuries in Libya for 3 years, always from a position of colonial superiority. The hospital where she worked had better facilities than any Libyan clinic, but Libyan patients received inferior care, were housed in separate wards, and were often refused treatment if Italian patients needed beds. She had participated in that system without seriously questioning it. It was simply how things were. Now she was receiving care from those she'd considered beneath her. The irony was not lost on her. The children responded first. Kids have an instinct that cuts through ideology and propaganda. Teresa Marchetti's 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, accepted a piece of flatbread from a Libyan boy about her own age. He smiled shyly. She smiled back. In that moment, the entire colonial project, the claims of racial superiority, the justifications for domination, crumbled into the absurdity they always were. The British guards, observing this interaction, were themselves surprised. They'd expected the African villagers might be hostile or at least indifferent. Britain's own colonial record in Africa was hardly benevolent, and these soldiers knew it. They'd been prepared to intervene if violence erupted. Instead, they witnessed something that challenged their own assumptions. One guard, Private James Cooper from Manchester, would later write in a letter home, "The African people showed more Christian charity than I've seen in most churches. Made me think about what we're really fighting for, and who the civilized ones actually are." The prisoners were allowed to rest in the village for several hours. Some lay in the shade of buildings, their bodies finally cooling after the brutal march. Others sat with their children, feeding them small portions of bread and dates. The villagers maintained a respectful distance. This wasn't about creating friendships, but about maintaining human dignity in circumstances that threatened to destroy it. Elder Mahmoud observed from near the well. A younger man approached him, still unconvinced. "We've given them our food," he said. "Food our own children need." "Why?" Mahmoud was quiet for a moment, then replied, "The Italians took much from us. They took our land, our dignity, our brothers and fathers. If we deny food to these women and children, what have we gained? We become thieves of a different kind. We steal our own souls. This," he gestured toward the scene of Italian mothers feeding their children bread provided by Libyan hands, "this is how we prove we are better than those who oppressed us. Not with weapons, but with humanity they tried to take from us." As night fell, the British guards ordered the column to continue. There was still distance to cover before reaching the temporary internment facility. The women gathered their children, standing slowly, their bodies aching but their spirits somehow lighter than before. Maria Rossetti looked back at the village as they departed. She tried to memorize the faces, the small mud brick buildings, the well in the center. She knew she would never forget this place, this Settlement 47, that had shown her something her own civilization had failed to teach. That compassion doesn't require agreement, shared nationality, or even a common language. It requires only the recognition that suffering is suffering, and humanity is humanity, regardless of what uniform or flag separates us. The journey continued for 3 more days. The replacement trucks eventually arrived, but mechanical problems persisted. Much of the distance had to be covered on foot. The Italian women's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Blisters became infected. Sunburns turned severe. Several women developed dysentery from contaminated water consumed before reaching the village. But something had shifted internally. The encounter at the village had cracked the propaganda they'd internalized. Conversations among the prisoners began to change. Where before they had spoken of Africans as a monolithic other, they now discussed specific faces, specific acts of kindness. Julia, the nurse, found herself thinking obsessively about the young woman who'd brought her water. She'd looked directly into Julia's eyes, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with something Julia couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps. An acknowledgement that circumstances could easily have been reversed. This realization was deeply uncomfortable. If Libyans were capable of this compassion, what did that say about Italian colonialism? What did it say about the hospital where Julia had worked, with its segregated wards and inferior treatment for African patients? What did it say about the entire moral framework that had justified Italy's presence in Libya? Teresa, the teacher, grappled with similar questions. She'd taught Italian children that they were bringing civilization to Africa. She'd read them sanitized stories of Roman expansion, portraying conquest as benevolent. Now her daughter Sophia kept asking about the boy who'd shared his bread. "Why was he nice to us, Mama? I thought you said they were different." Different. The word hung in Teresa's mind. Different how? In language, in culture, in religion, yes. But in fundamental humanity? The evidence suggested otherwise. The column passed other villages during the journey. Not all were as welcoming as the first. Some simply watched the prisoners pass without intervention, neither helping nor hindering. This was understandable. These communities had their own struggles, their own limited resources. They owed nothing to Italian colonizers, even those now reduced to prisoners. But at two other settlements, something similar to the first village occurred. Women emerged with water. Not abundant, the desert didn't allow for abundance, but enough. Small gestures that acknowledged the prisoners as human beings deserving of basic dignity. One village elder, speaking through a translator who worked for the British Guards, explained his reasoning: "Our water comes from Allah. It is not ours to deny to those who thirst, even if they are our enemies." This religious framing was important. Islam places tremendous emphasis on charity and hospitality. The Quran explicitly commands believers to feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty. These weren't abstract principles but lived obligations that shaped daily behavior. The British Guards, many of whom were nominally Christian, couldn't help but notice the contrast. In Europe, the war had unleashed unprecedented cruelty. Cities were being bombed. Civilians were being deliberately targeted. Concentration camps were exterminating millions. Yet here, in the uncivilized African desert, people were choosing compassion over revenge. Private Cooper wrote in another letter, "Makes a mockery of everything we claim about empire and bringing civilization to the savages. If this is savagery, it's better than most of what I've seen from civilized Europeans." Not all the prisoners experienced this epiphany, of course. Some women remained convinced of their racial and cultural superiority, interpreting the villagers' kindness as proof of African submission rather than humanity. Signora Fontana, a merchant's widow, insisted that the Libyans were helping because they recognized Italian authority, even in defeat. She couldn't or wouldn't see the reality in front of her. But for many others, perhaps the majority, the journey was transformative. Maria Rossetti began teaching her children basic Arabic phrases learned from the guards. Shukran, thank you. Min fadlak, please. Small attempts to bridge a divide she'd never questioned before. The internment camp, when they finally reached it, was a harsh awakening to new realities. It wasn't a concentration camp in the Nazi sense. There were no gas chambers, no systematic extermination. But it was hardly comfortable. The British had erected basic barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Sanitation was minimal. Medical facilities were inadequate. Food was rationed strictly. Approximately 4,000 Italian civilian prisoners were eventually interned in various camps across British-controlled territories. The women and children were generally kept separate from men, partly for security reasons and partly due to prevailing social norms about gender segregation. Life in the camp settled into a numbing routine. Wake at dawn. Line up for rations. Perform assigned work duties, cleaning, cooking, basic maintenance. Return to barracks. Sleep. Repeat. Children adapted with the resilience children somehow manage. They created games from scraps of wood and cloth. They formed friendships across family units. Sophia Marchetti became particularly close with Anna Bernardi, whose mother had died during the march. Teresa informally adopted the girl, giving her daughter a sister and Anna a new family. The camp administration was run by British officers, but much of the daily operation depended on local African laborers. These men and women brought in supplies, maintained the facility, and sometimes served as informal intermediaries between prisoners and administration. And here, something remarkable continued to happen. These African workers, who had every reason to treat Italian prisoners with contempt or indifference, generally didn't. They weren't warm or friendly. The power dynamics and recent history made genuine friendship impossible. But they were humane. A Libyan cook named Hassan, who worked in the camp kitchen, regularly provided slightly larger portions to children. When caught by a British officer and reprimanded, he simply said, "They are children. Children should not be hungry." He was transferred to other duties as punishment, but the message was clear. Compassion persisted even within systems of captivity. Julia, with her medical training, was eventually allowed to help in the camp's rudimentary clinic. She worked alongside British medical staff and African orderlies. The hierarchy was complex. She was a prisoner, but also a skilled professional. The British doctors needed her expertise, but couldn't fully trust her. The African orderlies had more freedom than she did, but less formal authority. Working closely with an orderly named Muhammad, Julia slowly learned about his life. He was 26, educated at a missionary school, and had worked as a teacher before the war disrupted everything. His village, not the one that had fed the prisoners, but a similar community, had been destroyed during Italian pacification operations. His father had died in an internment camp. His younger sister had starved during forced relocations. He had every reason to hate Giulia and everything she represented. Instead, he taught her how to treat desert-specific illnesses she'd never encountered in the segregated Italian hospital. He showed her which local plants had medicinal properties. He corrected her terrible Arabic pronunciation with patient humor. One day, after treating a child with severe dehydration, Giulia asked him directly, "Why do you help us? After everything Italians did to your people, why don't you hate us?" Muhammad was quiet for a long time. Then, "I do hate what was done. I hate the policies, the violence, the theft of our lands. But you," he gestured toward the child they'd just treated, "you didn't make those policies. You're a nurse who treats sick children. If I hate you for being Italian, what does that make me? The same as those who hated us for being African. I refuse to become what I oppose." Giulia had no response. She simply nodded and returned to work, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't quite explain. The war in North Africa continued for another 2 years after the Italian women's internment. Rommel's Afrika Corps pushed and retreated across the desert in what Churchill called this vast revolving battle. El Alamein became a turning point. By 1943, Axis forces were in full retreat. Italy itself was invaded, Mussolini was overthrown, and the Italian government switched sides, joining the Allies against Germany. For the interned civilians, these developments changed everything. Italy was no longer an enemy but a co-belligerent. The political status of the prisoners became ambiguous. Some British officials wanted to release them immediately. Others worried about logistics. Where would they go? Libya's Italian settler population had been decimated. Many of their homes had been occupied or destroyed. Their men were scattered across various POW camps in Africa, India, and elsewhere. The process of release was chaotic and slow. Families were reunited haphazardly. Maria Rossetti didn't see her husband for nearly 4 months after Italy's armistice, and when they finally met at a processing center in Tunisia, they barely recognized each other. He'd lost 40 pounds. She'd aged a decade in 2 years. Many Italian families faced impossible choices. Return to Italy, which was now a battleground between Allied and German forces. Stay in Libya, where their presence was increasingly unwelcome. Emigrate elsewhere, starting over with nothing? The African laborers who'd worked at the camps were dismissed as facilities closed. Most simply disappeared back into their communities, their role in this story largely unrecorded. Hassan, the cook who'd given extra portions to children, shook hands with several prisoners as he left. Giulia hugged Muhammad, breaking protocol and not caring. "Thank you," she said in broken Arabic. "For everything. For showing me what I couldn't see." Muhammad smiled sadly. "Go home," he said. "Teach others what you learned here." But what had they learned? And could those lessons survive the transition back to normal life? For some, like Signora Fontana, the experience confirmed existing prejudices. She returned to Italy insisting the internment had been a terrible injustice perpetrated by the British, conveniently forgetting the kindness of African villagers and focusing only on her suffering. She spent the rest of her life bitter and convinced of Italian superiority, impervious to evidence that contradicted her worldview. Others, like Maria Rossetti, were permanently changed. She settled in Turin after the war, working as a seamstress. She rarely spoke about her time in Libya. The memories were too painful, too complex. But when her grandchildren asked about the war, she told them about the village. About the water and bread. About the moment she realized that everything she'd been taught about civilization and barbarism was backwards. Giulia never practiced nursing again. The experience had shaken her too deeply. She'd seen the consequences of systemic dehumanization, how institutions she'd trusted and served had implemented policies that caused immense suffering. She couldn't return to that profession without confronting her complicity. Instead, she became active in early human rights organizations, working with refugees and displaced persons throughout the 1950s. Teresa continued teaching, but everything changed in how she approached her work. She refused to teach nationalist mythology. She introduced her students to diverse perspectives on history. When the curriculum demanded she cover Italian colonialism, she taught it honestly. The brutality, the exploitation, the resistance, and yes, The unexpected moments of humanity that emerged even in the darkest circumstances. Her daughter Sophia grew up to become a journalist specializing in North African affairs. In the 1970s, she returned to Libya, now independent under Gaddafi's revolutionary government, trying to locate the village that had helped her mother. The landscape had changed dramatically. Modernization and oil wealth had transformed many rural areas. She never found Settlement 47, which likely either had been abandoned, absorbed into a larger town, or simply never existed under that name in any records accessible to her. But she interviewed elderly Libyans who remembered the war years. Many shared similar stories, of choosing to help Italian prisoners despite having every reason not to. These accounts were usually brief, recounted without seeking praise or recognition. It was simply what had been done. The interesting thing, to the people being interviewed, was that anyone found it remarkable. One man, possibly the son or nephew of Elder Mahmoud, the names and timeline roughly matched, though certainty is impossible, explained, "We were taught that strength is not in revenge but in maintaining your principles when no one would blame you for abandoning them. Anyone can be kind to their friends. It means nothing. Kindness to your enemy, that is when you prove your character." This philosophy challenges the dominant narratives about World War II, which often portray the conflict in stark moral binaries. Good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, democracy versus fascism. Those frameworks aren't entirely wrong. Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were genuinely pursuing evil objectives through systematically brutal means. But human behavior doesn't neatly align with such grand narratives. Individual humans, even within oppressive systems, retain moral agency. The Libyan villagers who fed Italian prisoners weren't naive about colonialism or indifferent to suffering. They'd experienced occupation firsthand. They knew exactly what Italian rule had meant for their communities. Yet they chose compassion anyway, not because they'd forgiven Italian colonialism, but because they refused to let colonialism dictate their values. Similarly, the Italian women who experienced this compassion and allowed it to change them demonstrated that propaganda and nationalist mythology aren't permanent conditions. People can unlearn prejudice, can recognize their complicity in unjust systems, and can choose different paths forward. The historical record of these events is frustratingly thin. Most official histories of World War II's North African campaign focus on military maneuvers, battles won and lost, strategic objectives achieved or failed. Civilian experiences, particularly those of women and colonized peoples, are barely mentioned. The specific interactions between Italian prisoners and African civilians have left almost no documentary trace. What we have are personal testimonies, letters, diaries, oral histories collected decades later. These sources are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and filtered through layers of memory and interpretation. But their core truth is consistent. In the Libyan desert during World War II, some African villagers chose to feed their enemies' women and children, and that choice mattered profoundly to those who received that unexpected mercy. Stories like this one don't fit comfortably into conventional war narratives. They complicate our understanding of who deserves sympathy, who holds moral authority, and how we judge historical actors. The Italian women were both victims of war, displacement, and hardship, and beneficiaries of a colonial system that brutalized Africans. The Libyan villagers were both oppressed people and moral exemplars whose actions shamed those who claimed to bring civilization to Africa. Perhaps that's why these stories get forgotten. They're too messy, too uncomfortable, too resistant to simple conclusions. But they're also essential. They remind us that even in war's darkest moments, humanity persists. They challenge us to extend compassion even when it isn't deserved, especially when it isn't deserved. They demonstrate that our highest principles mean nothing if we only apply them to people we like or agree with. The women who expected hell in Libya and found unexpected mercy carried that lesson forward. Some taught it to their children and grandchildren. Others let it fade, too painful or too challenging to integrate into their understanding of the world. But the story survives, waiting to teach us what bread and water in the desert really mean. If this story moved you and you want to hear more forgotten narratives from history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. History isn't just about battles and dates, it's about moments of humanity that challenge everything we think we know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.